We're here today speaking with Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman. Rabbi Berman is a professor of Tanakh at Bar-Ilan University. And today we're here to discuss his new book, Ani Maamin, Biblical Criticism, Historical Truth, and the 13 Principles of Faith, published by Magid Books. This is the first full-length book by an Orthodox thinker to tackle the challenges posed by biblical criticism to traditional belief. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks has called this book a bold and brilliant defense of the integrity of the Torah and of faith in revelation by one of the most original biblical scholars of our time. Rabbi Berman, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure.
So let's talk a little bit about your book. Orthodox rabbis and educators have long avoided raising the questions posed by biblical criticism. Why do you think now is the time to write this book and bring this all out in the open?
Okay. The answer is it's already out in the open because young people today see these questions and see alternative approaches to our holy scriptures already online. And I see this in the gap year programs that I teach and college students, and I see this in the emails that I receive from folks in their 20s. The questions are out there and the alternative approaches are out there to what we offered in our tradition. And when we don't have any voice in the matter, when we don't have anything that we can articulate to these people that are asking these questions, the only conclusion they come to is, well, if those that represented to me the tradition when I was younger and in school, my rabbis, my educators, if they didn't have anything to say in the tradition's defense, then I guess the tradition doesn't have a defense against these issues. And so we really have to be out there with resources to answer questions about biblical criticism, about the authenticity of the events that are described in the Tanakh. And when we don't have those resources, we pay a price. We pay a price because there are people that are left with gnawing questions, because they have a little guy on their shoulder called their conscience that speaks into their ear and says, you know, you're saying all these prayers, you're reading all of these texts in the Chumash, but you know that there's a problem here. So we have people who are really struggling. And then we have also people who are not struggling because they've given up on the coherence of any of our belief systems. They're still within our shuls because they like the sense of community, the sense of ritual, but it only winds up being what we call today social orthodoxy. But you know, there might have been a revelation at Sinai or an exodus from Egypt. They don't want any of that. And so it's important before people fall into that position to make it known that we have ways of answering questions of these sorts in ways that have spiritual and intellectual integrity. I would say the bottom line here as to why it's so important now to roll up our sleeves, look at the evidence, come up with alternatives, with approaches that are academically valid. It reminds me of when I was young, growing up in New York, the slogan of the New York State Lottery. It's very apt here as well. You got to be in it to win it.
Very good. So in the book, you make claims in the name of scholarship, and you're a professor of Bible at Bar-Ilan, but you're also an Orthodox rabbi. So doesn't that mean that the things that you write about are somewhat biased? I mean, how are readers supposed to trust you?
So the question, do I come to my scholarship as an Orthodox rabbi? The short answer is guilty as charged. Let me explain what I mean by that. All scholars are coming to their work with their background, with who they are. And you know, in many cases, in academic studies, those backgrounds are celebrated. You know, when a feminist comes and does feminist approaches to the Bible, that's considered okay. And I will say that there are some brilliant insights from feminist scholars that have helped me as a religious Jew understand the Tanakh better. And there are scholars that are disabled and they come with the sensitivities of disability studies. And they bring out the most amazing things about certain passages in the Tanakh. Well, it's no less true when you come as an Orthodox Jew and as an Orthodox rabbi, that you can have certain insights that aren't available anywhere else. But what's really critical here is that when anybody comes with their own baggage, their own background, and they come up with insights, can you express the insights in a way that are valid to the rest of the academic community. And my commitment to the readers of this book is the following, that everything that I claim academically in Ani Maamin has already been accepted in the highest levels of academic publishing, whether it's the 2 books that I wrote about the Torah that were published by Oxford University Press, or by a long list of academic journals of the highest caliber. So that all of the editors, all of the readers who read those materials when I submitted them, they didn't see my name, they didn't see my beard, they didn't see my kippah, and they said, wow, this is good stuff. Now, in all fairness, it does not mean that the entire gamut of biblical scholars, or even a majority, necessarily agree with me. What it does mean is that a wide range of scholars have looked at the material that is behind this book and have said, the arguments here are valid and they are worthy of our consideration. I'll just add to that I think that being an Orthodox rabbi actually makes me a better Bible scholar, and I'll tell you why. It's because when scholars say that a certain story doesn't have any authenticity to it in historical fact, and I, because I am an Orthodox rabbi, say, well, you know, let me go check. Let me maybe look under some stones that others haven't turned over yet, and I find things there. Then other scholars, this is the work that I get the highest accolades for. Other scholars say, wow, that's really cool. No one ever thought to look in those places. Or when scholars say, these texts, they're so riddled with contradiction. There's no way to read this as a coherent text. And I find parallels elsewhere in ancient Near Eastern writing that have these very same types of seeming contradictions where we know that, that those compositions were written by a single agent, by a single author. That's when scholars say, wow, this is really interesting. No one ever thought to look in these places before. And so these are examples where being an Orthodox rabbi makes me a better Bible scholar.
It's fascinating. So you've mentioned a few times that you've had your own personal journey toward writing this book. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I want to speak about maybe 3 stations in my life that have led up to this book. And I'll start just by a conversation that I've had with a number of friends of mine, friends who are very, very serious Jews. These are people who are very learned, who learn every day, who daven with a minyan 3 times a day, who have said to me when I describe the type of work that I'm doing here in Ani Maamin, they say to me, you know, the Exodus, I don't really care if there was an Exodus. If someone said to me there was never an Exodus, it wouldn't change my commitment to Yiddishkeit at all. And I'm always in kind of, I don't know what to do with that. That's kind of a mind bender for me. Is that better? Is that worse? I know one thing for sure. I can't live like that for myself. And this is where we come to the first, I would say, formative stage of my life that led to Ani Maamin. And that is that my parents were not from traditional homes. But thank God they had the good vision to send me to a yeshiva day school and get a good education at SAR Academy in Riverdale and then at Ramaz in New York City. And somewhere along the line, around the time of my bar mitzvah, is when I took on full observance. So my entire life has kind of been weighing things and thinking about things. When other people say to me, it doesn't matter to me whether there was an Exodus. I'm committed to the tradition because my grandfather was committed to the tradition, because this was my mother's milk. I hear it. That's great. It works for a lot of people, but I need to kind of understand things. So that's the first thing. I would say the second formative stage for me leading to this book was, as I mentioned, I went to high school at Ramaz. The book is dedicated to my first Rebbe, Rabbi Jack Yaakov Bieler, who I had for 4 years at Ramaz. And he taught us that the way of serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Almighty, is through hard work and hard questions and struggle. And so dealing with hard things and coming up with answers, sometimes we don't have all the answers, is just a natural way of working for me. And it's really due to Rabbi Bieler and why it's such a privilege for me to dedicate the book to him. I would say that the third really formative stage for me, or event, came about 10 years ago, where a colleague of mine saw that this issue of biblical criticism was becoming more of a popular thing, not just limited to a few people in the ivory tower, but really out there in our shuls, in our communities. And this colleagues brought together about a dozen of us. Some of us religious Bible scholars, some of us rabbis in shuls, some of us educators in different settings, to think together about how will we address this issue of biblical criticism in all its forms, about whether there's multiple sources, whether the stories are true or not true. How will we relate to this? And I thought, this is going to be great. We're all going to roll up our sleeves and work together. And I was shocked, I was dismayed to see that so many of these people who are really significant figures and who I really respect as serious servants of the Almighty, basically said, oh, well, it's clear that everything that the university is telling us must be true, and therefore we have to find a way to just deal with that. And basically the tradition has to become a handmaid who bows to the master of what the university has told us. And being situated myself in a Bible department and reading the journals and going to the conferences and knowing a little more than some of the other people there, I was like, no, we can do much better than that. There might be a need for us to re-examine certain voices or expand the range of voices that we hear in our tradition, and some of that is certainly in my book. But a lot more is to really look carefully at the scholarship and its underpinnings and its first assumptions, and to see what we can do to push back. And so those are the things. That was 10 years ago. This book has been 9 years since in the making.
Wow, 9 years. Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit more. What excites you about Ani Maamin?
What excites me? I'll give you one example, Yudit, from the book. It's a little nugget, not my own discovery, but it illustrates so much of what happens in the book. I want us to think about a phrase that we all know just from sitting around the Seder table, that Hashem took us out of Egypt, biyad chazakah uvizor netuyah, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. I want us to think about that phrase. That's a phrase that you could expect that the Torah or the Tanakh would use on many occasions when God does a great miracle, that the Tanakh would say, oh, and here God did this with his yad chazakah and zor netuyah, his mighty hand and his outstretched arm. But it turns out that this phrase appears almost exclusively in the Tanakh only with reference to the Exodus from Egypt. Now, why is that? Well, it turns out that when we look at Egyptian inscriptions from the late second millennium, talking about a certain period of Egyptian history, 1500 to 1200 BCE, which is a period of time that would fit the traditional dating of the servitude in Egypt. What you find is that you have inscriptions about the pharaohs that reigned during that time, and every major accomplishment of a pharaoh, it says in those inscriptions, and the pharaoh did this with his mighty hand and his outstretched arm, over and over and over again. And so what we have here is the dynamics of appropriation, of stealing their thunder, of defeating the Egyptians through the rhetoric of their own inscriptions and saying, God, he's the one who acts with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And this is an example of how we can use the ancient Near Eastern context of the Torah to bring fascinating, beautiful, new insights to our study of the Tanakh. And even though this might seem like a newfangled thing, it's very well rooted in our sources. The Rambam talks about this many, many times in the third section of the Moreh Nevuchim, of the Guide to Perplexed. And he finishes in the last chapter of that book, and he says, oh, if only I had access to more knowledge about the ancient Near East, I would understand more about what the Torah is trying to convey to us. And we today have the great blessing of access to many, many, many texts that reveal incredibly beautiful light about what's happening in the Torah. And so what really excites me is that I get to study this stuff. And I even get paid a salary to study this stuff. And then I get to take these insights and add some of my own and share them with other people. What could be more exciting than that?
Well, this sounds absolutely fascinating. Rabbi Berman, thank you so much for giving us a glimpse into your new book. We invite all of our viewers to go out and pick up a copy of Ani Maamin. It's available from our website. It's available in local Jewish bookstores and, of course, on Amazon. Thank you very much for joining us.